The feed cut at 3:47 hours. No warning, no distortion, just silence where there should have been chaos. In the Tactical Operations Center at Bagram, Major Kincaid stared at the wall of screens showing nothing but static from grid November 7. 12 Marines were pinned in a valley the maps called the Serpent's Throat, and the only aircraft in range had been an A-10 Thunderbolt II with a pilot nobody wanted. The last transmission was garbled, a woman's voice tight with concentration, then nothing. Kincaid's hand hovered over the phone that would activate search and rescue. Somewhere in the Hindu Kush, under a moonless sky, Captain Rhiannon Valk was either dead or about to become a legend. 6 hours earlier, the ops brief had been routine. Valk sat in the back row of the briefing room, her flight suit faded from too many deployments, her face impassive as the mission commander outlined a supply convoy escort. Simple, boring. The kind of mission they gave to pilots they didn't trust with anything important. She'd heard the whispers since she arrived at the forward operating base 3 weeks ago. Too cautious, too precise, flew like she was afraid to scratch the paint. Her call sign was porcelain, and it wasn't meant as a compliment. The men who'd flown with her in training said she was technically perfect but lacked aggression, that she treated the A-10 like a museum piece instead of the flying gun platform it was designed to be. Nobody mentioned that she had more flight hours than half the squadron combined, or that she'd requested the A-10 specifically after flying F-16s for 6 years. They only saw what they expected to see. The convoy had been rolling through Nangarhar province when the Taliban opened up from 3 positions simultaneously. Mortars first, then heavy machine guns, then RPGs that turned the lead Humvee into scrap metal. The Marine radio operator's voice cracked as he called for close air support, giving coordinates that put them in a valley so narrow the walls seemed to touch the sky. Valk was airborne within 4 minutes, her A-10's twin turbofans pushing her southeast while she studied the tactical display. The valley was a nightmare, barely 1,000 feet wide at the bottom, with enemy positions on both ridgelines. A faster jet would have to make runs perpendicular to the valley axis, spending seconds over target. The A-10 could work the length of the valley, but it meant flying into what was essentially a shooting gallery. Her weapons systems officer, Lieutenant Marcus Cortez, pulled up terrain data and said nothing. He didn't have to. They both knew what this was. The A-10 was never beautiful. It was built around a gun, the GAU-8 Avenger, a 7-barrel rotary cannon that fired depleted uranium rounds capable of shredding tanks. Everything else about the aircraft was designed to keep that gun flying and fighting. The engine sat high on the fuselage to reduce infrared signature and protect against ground fire. The cockpit was surrounded by titanium bathtub armor thick enough to stop 23 rounds. It was slow, ungainly, and designed for one purpose: close air support in the worst possible conditions. Valk had fallen in love with it the first time she flew one, not despite its limitations but because of them. This was an aircraft that stayed when others left, that flew low and slow through hell because the people on the ground needed it too. Now those people were Marines trapped in the Serpent's Throat, and she was their only option. She pushed the throttles forward and descended into the valley as dawn broke over the mountains. The radio chatter was frantic, multiple voices overlapping, as the Marines tried to coordinate their defense. She could see muzzle flashes on both ridges, tracers arcing down toward the canyon floor where vehicles burned and men fought from behind whatever cover they could find. Cortez was marking targets on the display, prioritizing the mortar positions that could adjust fire onto the trapped convoy. Valk's voice came over the radio, calm and measured, asking for smoke to mark friendly positions. Purple smoke bloomed among the rocks below, and she began her first run. The A-10 shuddered as she fired the GAU-8, the sound like ripping canvas, impossibly loud even through her helmet. The first mortar position disappeared in a cloud of dust and debris. She pulled up, banking hard to line up on the second target, and that's when the mountain came alive with anti-aircraft fire. Tracers filled the sky, green and red lines crisscrossing the narrow space between the ridges. Valk pushed the stick forward, diving toward the valley floor to get below the worst of it, the A-10's terrain following radar screaming warnings she ignored. She could see individual fighters now, men with rifles and RPGs moving along the ridgeline, trying to get angles on the Marines below. She walked the gun across their positions, the 30mm rounds chewing through rock and flesh with equal efficiency. The A-10 took hits. She felt them as shudders through the airframe, but the redundant systems kept flying. Hydraulics were damaged. She was losing pressure, but the manual reversion system meant she still had control. She called out her damage to Cortez, kept her voice level, and set up for another run. The Marines on the ground were cheering over the radio, calling her back, giving her new targets. She obliged. The Taliban fighters had never faced an A-10 before. They were used to fast movers that screamed overhead and disappeared, dropping bombs from altitude and vanishing before anyone could react. This was different. This aircraft stayed, circling like a predator, its pilot learning the terrain with each pass, finding every fighting position and systematically destroying them. They concentrated their fire, dozens of weapons tracking the gray shape as it maneuvered through the valley. Valk felt the aircraft taking damage, warning lights illuminating her panel like a Christmas tree, but the A-10 was designed to absorb punishment. One engine was running rough. She'd lost partial hydraulics in 2 systems, and her right aileron was barely responding, but she was still flying and the gun still worked. She made 6 runs through that valley, each one more dangerous than the last, until the enemy fire slackened and finally stopped. The Marines were moving, carrying their wounded to the remaining vehicles, preparing to extract. She stayed overhead, circling, daring anyone to take a shot. Nobody did. That should have been the end of it. A successful mission, damaged aircraft, returned to base for repairs and debriefing. But at 3:42 hours, as Valk was setting course back to Bagram, a new voice came over the emergency frequency. Another Marine unit, Alpha Company, had walked into an ambush 15 miles north. They were surrounded, taking casualties, and the quick reaction force was still 40 minutes out. Every other aircraft was already tasked or too far away. Valk checked her fuel, checked her ammunition, and checked the damage reports Cortez was pulling up on his displays. They had maybe 30 minutes of loiter time, less than 200 rounds remaining in the gun, and an aircraft that was barely holding together. Cortez looked at her, waiting. She changed course without saying a word. Sometimes you don't need orders. Sometimes you just need to be the person who doesn't leave. The new coordinates put them over terrain that made the Serpent's throat look friendly. Higher elevation, steeper valleys, and an enemy that now knew an A-10 was in the area and was ready for it. Valk climbed to get a better picture of the tactical situation, and that's when the SA-7 missile launched from the northern ridge. The portable surface-to-air missile wasn't sophisticated, but it didn't need to be. It tracked the A-10's heat signature and came up fast. Valk saw the smoke trail, punched out flares, and threw the aircraft into a diving turn that should have been impossible with her damaged control surfaces. The missile went for a flare and detonated 200 feet behind her, but the shrapnel caught her left engine. The turbofan came apart in a spray of metal, and suddenly, she was flying on one engine with almost no hydraulic pressure and control surfaces that responded more to prayer than input. Cortez was talking fast, running emergency procedures, calling out altitudes and airspeeds as Valk fought to keep the A-10 in the air. She should have declared an emergency, should have climbed for altitude, and pointed the aircraft toward the nearest friendly base. Instead, she descended into the valley where Alpha Company was dying. The Marines on the ground could see her now, could see the smoke trailing from the dead engine, could hear the remaining turbofan screaming as it tried to keep the heavy aircraft aloft. They thought she was going down. They were already calling for rescue helicopters when her voice came over the radio, still calm, still measured, asking for target coordinates. She made 3 more runs with an aircraft that was barely controllable, each burst from the gun pushing the nose up and requiring immediate correction with control surfaces that didn't want to respond. She destroyed 2 machine gun nests and a mortar position, and she gave Alpha Company the 30 seconds they needed to break contact and fall back to a defensible position. Then the feed went dark. Her radios cut out, every transmission turning to static. In the Tactical Operations Center, they watched her transponder blink twice and disappear. Kincaid grabbed the phone, started calling search and rescue, but everyone in that room was thinking the same thing. Nobody survives a crash in those mountains. Nobody walks away from an A-10 that's been shot to pieces, flown beyond its limits, and pushed into terrain where there's no room for error. Valk was gone, and with her went any chance of immediate support for the Marines still fighting below. The rescue helicopters were spinning up, but they'd need Apache escorts, and those were 20 minutes away. Alpha Company was on their own. The men in the operations center stood in silence, watching empty screens, listening to the crackling of radios carrying voices that were asking where the A-10 had gone, asking when help was coming, asking questions nobody could answer. But Valk wasn't dead. She was flying 10 feet off the valley floor, her damaged aircraft shaking itself apart, her radios fried by an electrical fire she'd managed to suppress with a halon bottle that should have been used for the engine. She couldn't transmit, couldn't receive, and couldn't see much beyond the terrain directly in front of her because the smoke from the dead engine was obscuring half her canopy. She was flying by instinct and instruments, keeping the aircraft level through force of will, and she was running out of options. The valley was narrowing, the walls closing in, and she needed altitude to clear the ridge ahead. But gaining altitude meant exposing herself to whatever anti-aircraft weapons were still active, and her aircraft couldn't take another hit. She could try to put down in the valley, perform a controlled crash in the rocky terrain, but that meant abandoning the Marines who were still fighting. Cortez was unconscious in the back seat, overcome by smoke, and she was alone with a decision that would define everything that came after. She chose to climb, not a steep climb that would bleed too much airspeed, but a gradual ascent that kept her close to the terrain and made her a harder target. The A-10 responded sluggishly, the single engine howling, the airframe creaking as she coaxed it upward. She cleared the ridge by less than 50 feet, so close that she could see individual rocks on the summit, and then she was over and descending into the next valley. The smoke from her dead engine was a banner behind her, visible for miles, and she knew every Taliban fighter in the province would be tracking it. She needed to get low, needed to disappear into the terrain, but first she needed to find Alpha Company. Without radios, she had to navigate by dead reckoning and memory, following the coordinates she'd memorized before the electrical fire took out her systems. She found them by the smoke of their grenades, purple clouds marking their position in a small bowl surrounded by high ground. The Taliban was closing in. She could see them moving through the rocks, dozens of fighters converging on the Marine position. Valk had maybe 50 rounds left in the gun and an aircraft that might not survive another pass. She didn't hesitate. She rolled into a dive, lined up on the largest group of enemy fighters, and pressed the trigger. The GAU-8 roared one last time, the depleted uranium rounds tearing through the Taliban formation and sending survivors scrambling for cover. She pulled up, felt something major let go in the starboard wing, and knew she was out of time. The A-10 was done flying. She turned southwest, toward friendly territory, nursing the aircraft through air that felt thick as syrup. Every control input a negotiation with an airframe that wanted to quit. Cortez was stirring in the back, coughing, asking what happened. She told him to prepare for a hard landing and focused on finding somewhere flat enough to put down. She found it 10 miles inside friendly territory, a straight section of damaged highway that American engineers had abandoned months ago. It wasn't long enough for a proper landing, but it would have to do. She came in low and slow, her one working engine barely providing thrust, the damaged wing threatening to stall at any moment. The A-10 hit hard, bounced, hit again, and skidded down the broken asphalt trailing sparks and parts. She stood on the brakes, felt them heating up, felt the aircraft slewing sideways, and then they were stopped, sitting crooked in the middle of nowhere with smoke pouring from every seam in the fuselage. She killed the remaining engine, ran the emergency shutdown checklist from memory, and helped Cortez out of the back seat. They were still sitting on the wing when the rescue helicopters found them 30 minutes later, covered in soot and hydraulic fluid, alive when they had no right to be. The crew chief who pulled her into the Black Hawk said the entire base was talking about her, that the Marines from both units were demanding to know who flew the A-10, that the operations center had declared her dead, and then had to explain to a general why nobody could confirm it. The after-action report ran to 40 pages. Valk had spent 90 minutes over 2 separate firefights, taken more than 100 hits from small arms and heavy weapons, lost an engine to a surface-to-air missile, and brought her aircraft back to something resembling controlled flight despite having no hydraulics, no radios, and damage that should have made the A-10 unflyable. The Marines she'd covered had 0 fatalities despite being outnumbered and outgunned. The Taliban fighters withdrew from that entire sector and didn't return for 6 weeks. The maintenance crews at Bagram spent 3 days cataloging the damage before declaring the aircraft a total loss. They took photos of the holes in the wings, the shredded control surfaces, the destroyed engine, and the scorched cockpit where electrical fires had melted through insulation. They couldn't believe anyone had kept it in the air long enough to make one run, let alone multiple passes followed by a dead-stick landing. The photos went up on the ready room wall, and pilots who'd never spoken to Valk before started asking questions about how she'd done it. The call sign changed first. Nobody called her Porcelain after that. The Marines started it, the ones who'd been in the Serpent's throat and watched her fly through a wall of tracers like it meant nothing. They called her Valkyrie, the chooser of the slain, the one who decided who lived and who died on that battlefield. It spread through the base in hours. By the time she was cleared to fly again 3 weeks later, after the flight surgeons confirmed she had no lasting injuries and the shrinks confirmed she wasn't suffering from PTSD, everyone knew the name. The mission planners stopped giving her escort duty and started putting her on the complex missions, the ones that required precision and judgment and the kind of courage that can't be taught. She flew another 60 missions in that deployment, and pilots started requesting to fly with her, which was a kind of honor she'd never expected. But the real change was quieter, more personal. Valk had always been reserved, professional to the point of seeming cold, focused on the mission rather than the camaraderie. After the Serpent's throat, she opened up. She started attending the ready room gatherings, telling stories about her training, explaining why she'd chosen the A-10 over faster jets. She'd been flying F-16s for 6 years, she told them, and she'd been good at it. Top of her class in weapons school, combat decorations from missions over Syria and Iraq, the kind of record that usually led to test pilot school or a command position. But she'd put in for a transfer to A-10s because she was tired of being a mile above the fight, tired of dropping weapons from altitude and never seeing the results, never knowing if what she'd done had mattered. The A-10 put you in the fight, made you part of it, forced you to see what you were doing and who you were helping. It was personal, intimate, dangerous in ways that transcended simple risk. It meant something when you put an A-10 between the enemy and the people who needed you. That's what she'd wanted, and that's what she'd found. The younger pilots listened to her like she was speaking gospel. They'd grown up wanting to fly fighters, wanting the speed and the glory and the high-altitude missions that looked good in recruiting videos. Valk was showing them something different, a kind of flying that required different skills and different courage. She became a mentor without trying to be one, and pilots started changing their career tracks to follow her path. The A-10 community, always small and always underappreciated in an air force that loved high-tech stealth jets, suddenly had a waiting list of pilots who wanted in. Commanders noticed. The A-10, which had been on the chopping block for budget cuts for years, suddenly had advocates in places where it mattered. One mission, one pilot, one impossibly damaged aircraft that shouldn't have flown, and the entire trajectory of a weapons system changed, because people saw what it could do when flown by someone who understood its purpose. 6 months after the Serpent's throat, Valk was promoted to major and given command of the 74th Fighter Squadron, the Flying Tigers, one of the oldest and most decorated A-10 units in the Air Force. It was unusual, promoting someone that young to squadron command, but the recommendation came from the Marines she'd saved and from the pilots who'd watched her fly. The change of command ceremony was standing room only, and when she gave her speech she talked about the aircraft rather than herself. The A-10, she said, was designed by people who understood that war wasn't clean or distant or easy. It was designed to be flown by pilots who were willing to get low and slow and close, who understood that the mission wasn't about looking good or flying fast, but about bringing people home alive. That was the standard she expected from her squadron, and that was the legacy she intended to build. She flew training missions with every pilot in the squadron, teaching them the lessons she'd learned over the Hindu Kush. How to use terrain to mask your approach, how to read a battlefield from cockpit altitude, how to stay calm when the aircraft was taking fire and the mission was falling apart. She was demanding but fair, pushing pilots to their limits but never beyond them, and she had a gift for knowing what each person needed to improve. Some needed confidence, others needed humility. All of them needed to understand that flying the A-10 wasn't about individual glory, but about the people on the ground who depended on you. She built a culture of excellence in the squadron, and within a year the 74th had the highest readiness ratings and the best mission success scores in the entire Air Force. Other units started copying their training methods, their briefing formats, their approach to mission planning. Valk's influence was spreading beyond her squadron, reshaping how the Air Force thought about close air support. But the real legacy wasn't in the metrics or the awards or the promotion boards that kept moving her name to the top of the list. It was in the lives she'd changed, directly and indirectly. The Marines from the Serpent's Throat and Alpha Company stayed in touch with her, writing letters and sending photos of their families, telling her about the children they were able to raise because she'd brought them home. One of them named his daughter Rhiannon and sent Valk a photo of the little girl wearing a flight suit on her second birthday. Another became a pilot himself, inspired by watching the A-10 circle overhead when he was sure he was going to die. He flew Apache helicopters now, providing the same kind of close air support Valk had given him, and he told her it was the only career that made sense after what he'd experienced. The chain of influence extended outward like ripples, touching people who'd never heard of the Serpent's Throat, but were affected by the decisions made by people who had. The story spread beyond military circles. A documentary filmmaker embedded with the 74th for 6 months, creating a piece about close air support that featured Valk prominently. The film won awards, was shown in theaters, and suddenly people who'd never thought about military aviation were talking about the A-10 and the pilots who flew it. Congressional hearings that had been scheduled to discuss retiring the A-10 turned into debates about keeping it, with representatives citing the documentary and the Marines who testified about what the aircraft had done for them. The A-10 got funding for upgrades, new wings, improved targeting systems, a lease on life that extended its service for decades. Valk never claimed credit for that, but everyone knew the truth. She'd saved the aircraft by showing what it could do, and she'd done it without trying to be a hero, just by being a pilot who understood her mission. She made colonel at 36, younger than almost anyone in the Air Force, and took command of a wing that included 3 A-10 squadrons and 2 fighter squadrons flying F-35s. The assignment was a test, some people said, putting an A-10 pilot in charge of fifth-generation fighters, seeing if the lessons translated across platforms. They did. Valk applied the same principles to the F-35 units that she'd learned flying close air support. Know your mission, know your people, never ask them to do something you wouldn't do yourself. She flew with both communities, proving she could handle the F-35 even though it was completely different from the A-10, and she earned respect from pilots who'd initially been skeptical about being led by someone from a different weapons system. The wing flourished under her command, and she was being mentioned as a future general, someone who might eventually lead Air Combat Command or even become the Air Force Chief of Staff. But rank and position weren't what drove her. On nights when she couldn't sleep, when the weight of command and responsibility and all the decisions that affected thousands of lives became too much, she'd walk out to the flight line and sit under the wings of the A-10s parked in their revetments. The aircraft looked brutal in the darkness, all hard angles and exposed weapons, but she found them beautiful. They represented something essential about what she believed, that you showed up when people needed you, that you stayed when others left, that you accepted risk because the alternative was unacceptable. The A-10 wasn't fast or stealthy or elegant, but it was honest. It told you exactly what it was and what it would do, and then it did it without complaining or quitting. That honesty, that reliability, that refusal to be anything other than what it was designed to be, was what she tried to embody in her own life and career. Years later, when they finally did retire her original aircraft, the one she'd flown in the Serpent's throat, they didn't scrap it. Instead, it went to the Air Force Museum, restored and displayed with a plaque that told the story of that day. The plaque was factual, listing the dates and units and circumstances, but next to it, they played a video loop of interviews with the Marines who'd been there. These men, most of them middle-aged now with families and civilian careers, talked about what they'd seen and what it had meant. They described the sound of the GAU-8, the sight of the A-10 circling through the tracers, the moment when they thought the pilot was dead, and then the moment when they realized she was still fighting. One of them, a former sergeant named Davies who'd been hit 3 times during the ambush, looked directly at the camera and said something that became famous in military circles. He said, "We were dead, we knew it, and then she came back. She was on fire, she had no right to still be flying, and she came back. That's when I understood what it meant to be a warrior. It's not about winning or being brave. It's about showing up when people need you, even when it costs everything." The museum became a pilgrimage site for young pilots, especially women who were considering military aviation. They'd stand in front of the damaged A-10, looking at the holes in the wings and the scorched paint and the plaque that listed Major Rhiannon Valk's name, and they'd see possibilities. If she could do that, they thought, maybe I can too. Maybe being smaller or quieter or different isn't a weakness. Maybe it's just being something the military needs more than it realizes. Valk visited the museum once during a ceremony honoring close air support pilots, and she stood in front of her old aircraft for a long time without saying anything. Finally, someone asked her what she was thinking, and she smiled. She said, "I'm thinking about all the people who told me I was too careful, too precise, not aggressive enough. I'm thinking about how wrong they were and how right I was to ignore them. And I'm thinking about the Marines who are alive because I flew the way I knew was right, not the way other people expected me to fly." That became her legacy, not just the missions or the awards or the lives saved, but the permission she gave to others to be themselves, to fly their own way, to trust their own judgment, to understand that there wasn't one correct path to excellence. The A-10 community changed because of her, becoming more inclusive and more focused on mission accomplishment than on conforming to expectations. The entire Air Force changed slowly, as her influence spread through the officers she'd mentored and the pilots who'd flown with her. It wasn't revolutionary or dramatic, just a steady shift toward valuing effectiveness over appearance, results over style, the mission over the ego. That was always Valk's way, quiet and persistent, changing things by showing rather than telling, by being the example rather than preaching the doctrine. She retired as a lieutenant general after 30 years of service, and the ceremony filled an auditorium with people who'd come to honor her. 3-star generals didn't usually draw such crowds, but Valk wasn't usual. The Marines from the Serpent's Throat were there, gray-haired now, sitting in the front row with their families. The pilots she'd commanded and mentored filled the middle sections, representing every aircraft and mission type in the Air Force. In the back were the young cadets and officer candidates, there because they'd heard the stories and wanted to see the person who'd inspired them to serve. The speeches were long and detailed, chronicling deployments and commands and accomplishments, but the moment everyone remembered came at the end. Valk stood at the podium and talked about the A-10, about what it had taught her and what it represented. She said, "This aircraft saved my life by being exactly what it was designed to be. No apologies, no compromises, just honest capability in the service of a clear mission. That's what I tried to be, and that's what I hope I've taught others to be. Find your mission, understand it completely, and then execute it with everything you have. Don't worry about being what others expect. Be what the mission requires." The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes, and when it finally ended, the ceremony concluded with a flyover. 4 A-10s in finger four formation, flying low over the auditorium, the sound of their engines a reminder of everything Valk represented. As they passed overhead, the trailing aircraft broke formation and pulled up into the missing man formation, leaving a gap in the sky where Valk had once flown. It was tradition, a way of honoring service and sacrifice, but watching it from the ground, seeing that empty space where an aircraft should have been, people understood it differently. That gap wasn't absence. It was possibility, the space left for the next generation to fill, for the pilots who would carry forward what Valk had started. The mission continued, the aircraft continued, and the legacy continued, passed from one pilot to the next, each one learning that showing up when needed was the highest calling, and that flying low through hell for the people who depended on you was not just a mission but a way of life.